Yes, hold on a second.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. We'll cut this out.
Oh, so good. All right, cool.
All right. Okay. Let me pull up my questions so we're good to go. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm super excited to be here today with my friend, Tucker Wannamaker. Tucker, welcome.
Oh, it's so good to be here with you, Stephanie. I love it.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a while, I think, and we work together. And I've gotten to be a part of some of the things that your organization does, and it's awesome. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I would like you to tell us a little bit about your journey and what your organization does. Like, how did you get to where you are now?
Hmm. Well, I guess in a brief nutshell, our mission is to solve nonprofit leader burnout, and we're called Thrive Impact. And the reason why we're called Thrive Impact is because uh, because I've been a burned out nonprofit leader before, and I remember I was many moons ago. I owned a marketing company, and I ended up selling it, and went to go work full time into nonprofits. I had started a nonprofit with some of my friends in Colorado to raise money for wildfire relief efforts, and I just had this boot camp around like, what is a 501c3 in the first place? How do you even give money away? What is philanthropy? What's the purpose of a board? And then I moved to DC and worked inside of a few different nonprofits as the head of communications and the head of fundraising, and one in particular, I got completely just fried. I went into it wanting to quote unquote change the world, or at least help create impact and positive change, right, in the world and the lives of people that were serving in this organization, and I ended up leaving. I was the sole breadwinner at that point of a family of 6 in DC. I had 4 kids, and the way that this organization worked, which I realized was not abnormal, was quite normal many times, is that the work that this organization was trying to put out in the world was not how they lived inside of their organization, and
Mhm.
and it was just this like. I also learned I was also a little too idealistic myself, and was realizing how many things that I needed to reflect on myself. And so, anyway, long story short, there were so many factors involved that I've now unpacked a lot since then. And I met a gentleman named Kevin, who at that point was the CEO he had just stepped down as the CEO of the American Diabetes Association. And we both had similar stories. I came from small, scrappy nonprofits. He came from large institutional nonprofits, and we had similar stories. And we're like, what is going on in this space, and why is so many nonprofit leaders burning out? And so that's literally why we started Thrive Impact, was how do we go upstream with nonprofit leaders and to help them to thrive as individuals and within their organizations, so that they can create impact from the inside out, so they can have the impact their communities need from them and that they set out to have in the first place. And so that's a little bit of sort of the backstory of Thrive Impact and why we're here. And we've been around for about 5 years now.
Awesome. Thank you. I know I've seen that in our clients. I've experienced it myself as well, and talking to lots of different people in the sector. So how do you at Thrive Impact now, how do you help nonprofit leaders like fight that burnout? What do you do? How do you serve?
Well, there's a few different ways, but one of the main ways is that we we create conditions that allow for people to discover themselves. Um, we like to say, we never say that we're consultants. Actually, blatantly, we say we are not consultants, because sometimes that comes with baggage. Like, we're here to
Mhm.
come in and have answers for you. One of the things we're trying to very much get away from is we have the answers for you, because we actually believe you have so many of the answers yourself. And it's just a matter of us asking the great questions to unearth that, and for you to hear each other's voices in your organizations and across communities. And so we do have a client-based model where we work with organizations specifically on things like strategic planning, but not from a top-down approach, from a bottom-up co-created approach. We also have a community-based model called Thrivers, where we create conditions for nonprofit leaders to learn from one another. Because what we've learned about adult learning in general is that we actually don't learn very much from experts. We learn a lot more from our peers because we trust
Mhm.
it. We believe that there's a space of empathy that oh, other EDs understand me.
Mhm.
And so our job is to, while we bring in expertise through different content and different questions, what we're really trying to do is create the conditions for conversations to happen in unearthing the best of an organization or the best of a leader.
Do you consider yourself a coach? I feel like in the entrepreneurial space, there's definitely that distinction between consulting and coaching. And I feel like a lot of coaching is like leading the coachees to their own responses to their own observations versus, like you said, kind of telling somebody what to do. Do you consider yourself a coach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess not on a one-on-one basis, but yeah, and from a group perspective, for sure. Yeah, we do that at scale. I mean, literally, we'll have a Zoom room of 100 people from an organization or wherever, and what we're able to do is create the conditions where, even in that scale of a Zoom meeting, that people still feel really connected to each other, as well as being able to build sort of the collective identity of our organization. And so, in a sense, we're a coach, but kind of at a bigger scale, if you will,
Hmm.
beyond just like a one-on-one.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what do you think are some of the causes of a burnout of nonprofit leaders? Yeah, where is this coming from?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. You know, we have a dear mentor of mine, Dr. Daniel Friedland. He was a neuroscientist who wrote a book called "Leading Well from Within," and he gave us this beautiful language that just really is so helpful and accessible. And he said, you know, when demands exceed resources available to us, it sends our brains literally into spirals of reactivity, and it creates stress and self doubt. So that phrase, you know, that time when we're in our brain stem, really is what it is, when we're in the more unconscious, fast reactive parts of our brain, when we're in that fight, flight, freeze type of space, um, that tends to happen when the demands on us are exceeding the resources available to us. And resources could be all kinds of things. That's sometimes, of course, monetary resources. That's
Mhm.
relational and connective resources. That's literally ideas. I mean, there's a lot of different types of resources. Sometimes our own self, we can be a resource to ourselves, and the questions that we ask sometimes. But your question is really hitting on the demands, which is, what are the
Mhm.
demands that are creating these conditions? You know, and some of these demands, they're, you know, as I was reflecting on my own journey, I was looking at, there are structural demands that are in nonprofits. So, for example, there's some data that suggests that less than 1% of foundation dollars, which is in the billions of dollars, have
Mhm.
gone historically towards leadership development in nonprofits.
Mhm.
For profit businesses spend 4 times more on leadership development than nonprofits do. Well, that's a structural sort of belief that, if, you know, and I know in a lot of the work that we work with nonprofit leaders, is that sometimes there's almost this guilt that if I spend resources on us developing as leaders, it's stealing from the mission. It's
Mhm.
taking away. And so, but there's this sort of structural beliefs of a complete lack of investment in the nonprofit sector as a whole, and including things structurally speaking too. There's a, you know, how many of us as nonprofits have experienced the pain of people looking at our 990s and seeing, you know, did you really do too much towards overhead? And many people, there's lots of people who have talked about this, right? Dan Pallotta's got a whole thing on the whole TED talk many years ago, and
Mhm.
of this lack of ability to invest in our infrastructure. I don't call it overhead; I call it infrastructure, because a
Mhm.
business does too, right? I mean, they invest in
Yeah.
infrastructure that allows, but for some reason in the nonprofit space, it's looked at, it's kind of frowned upon the more that we invest there. And so there's these structural demands that are putting pressure on the nonprofit leaders to essentially do as much as you can for as little as possible.
Yep.
And it's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of organizational and cultural demands. So you go from the system down into the organization, and we do have cultures of overwork and underpay. We regularly do sacrifice people on the altars of missions. And so we take some of those structural belief systems and we apply them into our organizations. And we do have situations like what I grew up in, or grew up in, what I lived in, where the things that we put out in the world, the vision and the mission that we have, we literally do not even live into ourselves. Well,
Hmm.
that actually is a cancer inside of an organization. That grates away at people when our values and our behaviors are not aligned. It creates tension and stress. And then, some of the other issues, particularly around EDs and fundraisers, is that they're very isolated and lonely positions. Um, so from a CEO or an ED perspective, they're like this linchpin between a board and a staff. And what has happened many times in nonprofits is that a lot of nonprofit leaders are almost like they have to always perform, right? They always have to say,
Hmm.
because if I don't perform in terms of like always showing things are good, because if I'm
Hmm.
not showing that, then I'm not going to get the funding. Well, that actually is a recipe for disaster, because if we don't invite people in to the wins and the losses, like I think about, Charity Water is a great example of this. They have a donor community called the Well. And one of the things that I noticed about how they structured that in the first place was they created the conditions where the Well members, who are their major donors, were a part of the wins and the losses. They were a part of the
Hmm.
struggles and the progress. And because if you don't do that, it actually creates a lot of isolation for an ED and a CEO, always consistently feeling like they have to perform all the time. But I can't
Hmm.
really talk about things. Um,
Hmm.
and another
Yeah, because
issue.
I
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, related to that, there's sort of a lack of transparency, like you're saying, around the losses, because I think we also probably feel like, well, if I share that this thing kind of failed, I'm not going to get any more funding. Like,
Yeah.
my opportunities will go away if I shared that this was like less than perfect and wildly successful and hitting all the KPIs and all the things. So yeah, I feel like that lack of transparency as well. Like, an
Yeah.
ED has to be on and they can't really share what's like actually happening because they may lose funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very true. Um, and then there's these individual demands that we place on ourselves too. Kind of what I was saying. The sense, I know many of us deal in scarcity on a regular basis, and one of the things, as an example, that we use to combat this is, and I we did this for quite a while, and then I realized there's some Brene Brown research that actually directly backs this up in terms of getting out of scarcity. Is
Hmm.
we create conditions that allow for nonprofit leaders to literally reflect on their progress and their wins on a weekly basis, for them to like literally look back, like, hey, where did you have win and where did you have progress around? In this particular case, many times, or one part of our community will do around your leadership and around your revenue.
Hmm.
And that could, and I say, we don't have a measuring stick to measure whether yours was a big or a small win. Like, nobody brought their measuring stick today.
Hmm.
But when you can create a space where you're able to reflect on the best of who you are and have been over this last week, and sometimes the best of you is literally just showing up, right? And that's okay. But when you're able to
Hmm.
reflect on that in yourself, small progress and wins, and then share that with others and let others celebrate with you. We do a high thrive inside of Thrive Impact. We do like a hand up in the camera, as I'm doing right now with you. That I don't know if the
Love it.
listeners won't be able to see that, but when you
Love it.
create conditions like that, it actually helps us to get out of this scarcity, because there's many times, especially for those who are deeply mission driven nonprofit leaders, and I am one of them. Like I am that way too. I'm very mission driven. And I realize, especially as I continue to connect more and more with the pain of what's going on, it always feels like there's never enough, right? I'm never enough. It's never enough. The pain's too great. There's always going
Hmm.
to be somebody that is going through a lot of this, whatever it is that, whoever it is that you're serving. But
Hmm.
if we don't take time to pause and to reflect individually and create some conditions of just learning, that's what we don't learn from our experiences. We learn by reflecting on our experiences. And so individually, we can put too many demands on us by always feeling this space of it's never enough. But the reality is
Hmm.
there is enough, and we need to create those conditions that allow for us to pause, to notice, to reflect, and to see where we are having progress, because it actually actively gets us out of scarcity again, according to Brene Brown. So those are some of the
Hmm.
conditions that are creating burnout, and it's rampant, like all the way throughout,
Hmm.
systemically, organizationally, and individually. There's a lot of issues going on there that create exponential demands And then the last thing I'll share around this is that, especially for small community-based nonprofits and ones that are, which is who we mostly work with, and
Mhm.
especially those who are in human services, literally the demands on their organization because of needs that are in the community have gone exponential.
Mhm.
And the resources have not necessarily, both monetarily and staffing is a massive issue right now. 2023 is not going to be an exciting year for nonprofits from my perspective. And so we have to lean into different ways of operating. Otherwise we're all going to fry and it's not going to work very well. So
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that whole cycle is all tied together, that the nonprofits can't hire the staff because they don't have the money, because nobody's going to fund like, it's just this cycle that
yeah,
never it just doesn't end. So here's the $1 million question, or maybe like the $1 billion question. So how do we break the cycle? Tell me more about your approach and what you are doing with Thrive Impact to break the cycle. I know you talk a lot
yeah.
about sort of ditching this top-down approach to change. So tell me more about that. How are y'all helping to break the cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'll tell a story about myself, which was, earlier last year. I'm the CEO of Thrive Impact, and earlier last year, I'd been CEO for about 5 months, and you know this very well because you work with us on finances. We went through a pretty significant cash flow crunch. Where I literally didn't pay myself for 2 months because we just couldn't. Uh, and it was this crunch, and I was reflecting on that as a leader, and I was like, we have this framework that we use a lot of times, which is we come from a world that the speed and the complexity of change is happening at an exponential rate around us, but our ability to adapt to it as humans tends to be a little bit more linear. And sometimes, in workshops all the time, we'll ask, how many of you are looking back at the speed of change and you're like, I'm not sure how I adapt to that. I'm not sure how I adapt to that. And most everybody raises their hand and are usually laughing because they're like, oh my gosh, I feel seen, right? Because that's what's happening. The speed of change and the complexity of that change is happening very exponentially. And that's not a new concept. It just kind of got exacerbated, especially with the pandemic. And so,
Mhm.
one of the ways for us to shift our way of adapting to the speed and complexity of change is we need to unlock the heads and the hearts of all of our people, and at speed and at scale. How do we uh, unearth the best of our team, right? How do we unearth and actually let them in? We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier around Charity Water and what they did with the well. How do we let people in to co-create our future together? So we go back to my story. I realized we come from a world where leadership, quote unquote leadership, has historically been about the few who have the answers.
Mhm.
And I've asked that question to people. How many of you felt the pressure to have the answers? And I'm curious, listeners, like, how many of you have felt the pressure to have the answers?
Mhm.
Well, guess what? That's another way of creating isolation, is that because we come from a world that says that that's what a leader is. Like, a leader is somebody that we follow, where we
Mhm.
believe that leadership is actually something that is innate inside of everybody, because all of us have the ability to create influence in the organization. And so what I
Mhm.
realized when we were going through this cash flow crunch was I started reverting back into the old few who have the answers mentality, right? And it started to actually perpetuate cycles of reactivity for me. I started to feel like maybe I'm not the right person for this job, right? Imposter syndrome was hitting me. I was thinking, I've got to come up with the answer. I've got to come up with the answer. I got to come up with the answer. And then it dawned on me, and I literally teach on this stuff too. And like we train and do workshops on this. And this is where I so clearly realized and how important it is for me to continue to be a learner on the journey, which I am. And I was like, wait, leadership is not about the few who have the answers. It's about engaging the many in the power of great questions.
Mhm.
And that my job as a leader, whether it's a CEO or if I was a leader as an entry level person, is to invite people into co-creating what it is. And so once I realized, and again, it was it took a while. It took a good solid month of I remember the month of February in particular. And as we
Mhm.
went through towards the end of it, I reflected back and I was like, wait a second. Why am I beating myself up because I don't have the answer? And I mean,
Mhm.
and it was like, because I had that belief that my job was to have the answer, it started that spiral. And then and then the shame and the guilt and the imposter, and it all just kept going. And then I was like, wait a second, this all just goes back to that I don't have the right belief in the first place about leadership. And what are the best questions that I can ask our team to invite them into this struggle? And it was a real struggle. And just that shift for me personally was just realizing that this shift is a really courageous journey of going out of the belief that I have to have the answers and into the space of, hey, I don't necessarily have the answers. And honestly, sometimes when I do feel like I have an answer, it's even still better for me, especially as an ED and CEO, to invite co-creation and just let the team explore what it is that might be the best of us. And so many more innovations have come out of that. We've come out of that cash flow crunch. We ended the year financially in the best place we'd been all year. And a lot of that was due to creating our whole team. And I have to, give credit where credit's due to our whole team co-creating our process and our future around that this last year. And that's one of the biggest shifts that if you start to think about it, co-creation really co-creation unlocks so much more inside of an organization, to where it unlocks the leadership and it unlocks. I mean, we just had an example this last week where one of our team members, we have somebody who's we have A roles, which are people who are accountable over specific sort of buckets of our work. And this particular person was wrestling, and she was like, feeling like she didn't have the answers. And she came up with like how she wants to co-create this whole bucket of work around how we move forward with it. And it was just this beautiful, like, empowering moment that happened this last week that went through tension to get there. But it was this empowering moment of, I get to craft this, what this looks like, right? People have energy towards what they get to create. That's the phrase that I think about from a dear mentor of mine named John Berghoff. And I think about that quote all the time, because it's true. If I'm just telling people what to do, they're not going to have as much energy around it. But if I co-create with them, actually, I'll end on this particular piece. A dear mentor of mine, Dan Cardinale, he was the former, he had just stepped down as the CEO of the independent sector out in DC, which is a big advocacy organization for nonprofits. And I got to know him when I lived in DC, and he was really instrumental in me understanding impact and a lot of different components of nonprofit work. And he said something to me the other day, which has just stuck with me. He said, co-creation is the greatest form of humanity. And in like, in a real high level platitude. And I was like, but wait a second, that's like a big deal. When we create conditions to not allow co-creation, basically what he's saying is like, we're in some way stealing from people's humanity, because as humans, we are meant to create. And there's a lot of research that backs a lot of this up, particularly around leadership circle and leadership 360 assessments, and that we're in spaces of creativity. And creativity is not like, the creatives out there who are just, the graphic designers. But when we're able to shift from reactivity into creativity and be creators, it actually is the best form of leadership in general. And it gives us all the things that we're looking for, like more revenue, better impact, all those types of things, better culture. So co-creation is probably one of the biggest shifts that any nonprofit leader needs to make, which is getting out of that space of my job is to have the answers. In fact, it's better for us to engage people in the power of better questions.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Mic drop. That was so good, because I think it was like, yeah, that was so good. And I love that, that people have that energy towards what they get to create. And I think about this as well. I've thought about this before, sort of in the sense of transparency when it comes to your numbers. So I'm taking this idea and like thinking about it in terms of finance, but I've talked about that. Whereas like when you're transparent about your numbers, that is going to lead to greater engagement, whether it's with your team and sharing the budget. And, once they understand, they can be more engaged, or whether it's with your board or whatever. And so I think it's like the same sort of principle of what you're talking about. Like when you get to be part of something, you're naturally going to be more engaged and you're going to have more energy towards it. My question is, do you ever get any sort of like pushback on being more transparent? Like I was saying before, if we're transparent about the bad things or the like not so great things or the quote unquote failures. Is there like, do you get pushback from your EDs? Like, yeah, I don't want to feel isolated and lonely and feel like I have to have all the answers. But at the same time, like I feel very nervous about sort of airing my dirty laundry, or, being transparent about all the things with my team or with others. Do you get that?
Mm. I mean, I think I'm gonna answer this in a little bit of a different way in that um, co-creation as a process is a different way of thinking. And from a transparency perspective, I mean, there's some things like, especially speaking to all those HR people out there, there's some things like you literally cannot talk about, right?
Sure.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
And even too, like, I think I don't think it's appropriate for us to be transparent about all the things, but how are we leaning towards the side of transparency? How are we leaning towards the side? And this, let me give you an example of this in terms of like strategic planning. Actually, that's some of our core work. It's some of our best
Mhm.
work. Um, and one of the things that we've learned about strategic planning is, whenever we have workshops, we usually ask this question of how many of you ever felt the pain of an irrelevant strategic plan? And everybody laughs and raise their hand. Yeah, because we all have, right?
Yes.
Why is it a cliche in
Yeah.
nonprofits of the strategic plan sitting on the shelf gathering dust? Well, one of the main reasons is
Yes.
because it's a top-down approach. And what top-down
Mm.
approaches actually do is they're a lack of transparency many times. And I remember we did
Yes.
a podcast actually on our podcast, Thrivers, Nonprofit Leadership for the Next Normal, that I'm excited to have you on as well.
Yay.
Um, but we I interviewed Dr. Cynthia Whitaker because we went through a strategic planning process with her organization. She's the CEO of Greater Nashua Mental Health, a good sized community mental health organization in New Hampshire. And she said one of the things that was most powerful about the process was allowing the voices to hear the voices. Meaning we
Mm.
create, I was mentioning this earlier, right? We'll create conditions where it's, 50, 100, sometimes even 200 people all in one room. And the way in which we choreograph the conversations allows for still a close intimacy while at the same time being able to hear a lot of voices across. And she said, when top down approaches happen, it's kind of like, and we've all been there, right? It's the consultant that goes with the board on a board retreat for 4 hours or a full day, and they come up with the right answers for the organization, and they engage the staff through some kind of a dry survey, and so they checked off the box of we talked to the staff about it, or maybe they have a focus group of like 4 people. But when you create conditions where all the people are able to actually hear each other's voices, both in small groups and in a large group, that
Mhm.
transparency is powerful because it's trusted. It's trusted,
Mhm.
right? Like I didn't hear it through the lens of a consultant. I didn't hear it through the lens of a board member. I heard it through the lens of my peer. Like I
Mhm.
heard my peer talk about that. Like I love doing cross pollinating where the board chair is doing a deep paired interview is one of my favorite choreographies with one of the entry level people. I remember we did this with an organization where it was the board chair and the janitor, and we had them go into a
Amazing.
room and talk about what is a story of impact that tells me why it's so important for me to work at this organization, and
Wow.
that changed that board chair. Like
Mhm.
I remember she talked about that multiple meetings afterwards around like, man, just that story. And it wasn't through the lens of anybody. It was just straight from the person and the story that comes to mind around why it's so important for him to work at this organization. Right. So when
Mhm.
we create conditions for voices to hear voices, it's really powerful. But one of the things that EDs many times are nervous about around co-creation is, well, yeah, it's nice to have. We want people to feel heard, right? That's part of our neuroscience. We want people to feel like their voice matters. One of the most important factors involved in creating a high performing team, according to a deep research study by Google called Project Aristotle, is psychological safety, which means my voice matters.
Mm.
I can show up and be myself. Um, but we can't do all the things that everybody wants, right? We can't
Mhm.
do all the things. And so which is a tension of co-creation is like if we invite all the voices, how do we not do everything that all the voices want, right?
Mhm.
And so part of the
Mhm.
journey of co-creation is also, and we did another interview with a woman, we did another strategic planning process with, her name's Indy Frazee, and she's the CEO of a organization in Colorado Springs called the Independent Center, uh, versus Dan Cardinale's Independent Sector. I always have to think about that. They do a lot of work with those with disabilities, or like what we call those with unique abilities.
Mhm.
And and she said, one of the things that was so powerful about this journey that we went with them on was their team learning how to synthesize. It was actually, she literally said this. It was our strategic planning process was like professional development for their team.
Mm.
And what they learned, and the whole staff learned, and especially her sort of executive team, learned the power of how to synthesize, how to start theming. You have 100 different ideas. Well, what are the themes and synthesis down into the core components that we're able to really move forward on? And the synthesis team is what we called them. They're like the deeper listeners of the organization. And so that's where co-creation creates the space of transparency, while at the same time creates the space of synthesis for us to be able to actually move forward on things that are the deeper listening and the deeper initiatives that the organization is really coming up with around different innovations. And so that's where transparency is important. And the way in which to do co-creation is really important as well, in terms of making sure that people don't feel like that they do feel like their voice is heard, and that you're able to synthesize that down in an efficient way, and then close the loop with the staff too around that. And Indy has a great story on our podcast about that, specifically around how they did this whole process around their vacation policy, as an example. They were like, we
Hmm.
need to come up with a new vacation policy. We could go at it from more of a top-down approach of, hey, we're going to go as a leadership team and come up with what we think is our vacation policy.
Mhm.
Or, which they did that before, by the way, and she actually tells about that story from something different. I think it had to do with dress code back in the day. Well, there wasn't buy-in. It felt like a slog implementing in the first place. But on this
Mhm.
vacation policy process, there was buy-in right off the bat. And there were some ideas that people shared that literally were against the law. So they just transparently shared about that. It was like, well, we can't do that, and that's okay. Some
Yeah.
people just don't know that because they're not HR professionals, and that's not a problem. But they
Right.
were able to close the loop quickly with the team and say, here are the things that we're able to do based upon the best of your great ideas from this. And this is the vacation policy we're going to, move forward with. Does anybody have any feedback, or plus, we call them pluses and deltas around these things? And she said the buy-in on that was like it wasn't even a question. Like they're
Yeah.
just doing it now, right? So
Mhm.
co-creation also and transparency creates a space of buy-in that's way more efficient than any kind of top-down approaches.
Yeah, oh, I love that so much. So, obviously, if organizations want to do this for something like strategic planning, they could engage with you and your team at Thrive Impact. And if they want to, are there sort of not easier, but like any sort of like smaller ways that nonprofit leaders can begin to implement some of these like co-creation principles or activities within their organization without maybe necessarily like going out to work with somebody? Is there small ways that they can
Yeah.
begin to sort of implement this?
Yeah, of course. Well, I do want to mention we have a free workshop that we do literally once a month. Our next one's on March 8th. Um, and it goes through, it's completely free. Like our mission is particularly around small community-based nonprofits, and so we're continuing to work on our own sustainability around making sure that we can serve, because that's where most of the burnout lies, to be totally honest with you.
Mhm.
But some of the ways that people can think about this, around co-creating your future is, I actually would invite people to start with themselves. Is, when are you noticing that you're in a space where you think your job is to have the answer?
Mhm.
Right? What are the areas that are keeping you up at night, that now you're reverting back into this space of, I need to figure out the answer. I need to figure out the answer. And just
Mhm.
notice what's going on inside of yourself, and recognize that, one, you're probably going to have imposter syndrome, just like I do. I still do, from time to time, just like I did
Same.
back at that cash flow story. and
Mhm.
and say, you know what, perhaps there's a better question. Maybe there's a question that I can engage my team on to co-create some of this. And then
Mhm.
there are a variety of different questions. We have a whole 4I process, or 4I model that we use, that, many times when organizations have a problem, they they tend to go to, how do we solve that problem and what do we do about it? Well, there may be
Mhm.
another approach to this, which is, And sometimes that is where you need to go. We call that the implement phase. That's one of the I's. But sometimes you can go backwards a little bit and say, well, hey, what's been the best of us? What's been the best of us? We call that the identity phase. What what is it that we're actually building? So for example, on a more granular level, if you have a problem around donors and you're trying to build a major donor strategy, well, what's been the best of our major donor strategy up to this point? Not what's been broken, but what are we
Mm-hmm.
working? What are we building from? Right. And then if you go into the future, which the next I is imagine, is when we're able to grab images and textures of the future, it helps to really create a pavement for our present moving forward. And and so you can ask questions like, hey, a year from today, what do we want to celebrate about our major donor strategy? How do we
Mm-hmm.
want it to feel? What does it sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And then when you grab some of that data from those two identity and imagine sections, you can take that into innovate. Well, then how might we as a team collectively get there? And then you get into do and implement. So I'll end
Mm-hmm.
with this particular story, which is, I have a daughter. She's in high school, and she came home one day with a report card, and her report card had 3 A's, a B, and a C on it. Now, I know in the type of work that I do and in this model around 4 I's and strengths-based approaches and things like that, I know exactly where I'm supposed to go. But what do I typically do as a parent? Hey, what's going on with that C? What's going on with that C?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like we all do that. I do it. And I even teach
Mm-hmm.
on this stuff, and I still go to the C. Well, what
Mm-hmm.
does that help? What does she feel like when I ask her about the C? Probably a
Yeah,
little,
those A's are dismissed.
yeah, like in a little defensive and like, oh.
Yeah.
But I know based upon the science around the approach that we take, which is called appreciative inquiry, by the way, I haven't mentioned that yet, but we know based on the science of this strengths-based approach, if I ask her about the A's and I say, hey, tell me about the A's, what were the factors involved in those A's? How
Mm-hmm.
did you show up? How did your teacher show up? What was the process and the rhythm and the conditions that allowed for those A's to be there? That is a much better indicator or way and approach for her to be able to get her C up than if I go directly to the C.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start to shift our thinking in terms of not positivity, but strength, what are we
Mm-hmm.
building from? Because strengths are all that we have to build from. So that's what I would say for nonprofit leaders is is allow the space for people to reflect on and create learning environments that allow for you to reflect on a regular basis. What's been the best of you? Kind of like I said at the very beginning, right? Around, we ask nonprofit leaders, what's been the best of you over this last week? What are your wins and your progress? That's actually
Mm-hmm.
really important for our own psychology and for building the culture that we want to build in the first place and be a part of too.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I feel like there's not enough time for reflection, like, period. I feel like we are constantly thinking 4 steps ahead without ever doing any type of reflection. I'm speaking for myself and
Yeah.
for lots of organizations that I've seen. We don't often reflect enough. So I love that. My last question for you is, what does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
Mm. I mean, right off the bat is that they're thriving from the inside out, right? It's a prosperous nonprofit is one who creates conditions that allows for their people to thrive, which then subsequently will then allow those that they serve to thrive as well. And that's
Mm,
why I was saying some of these things. A prosperous nonprofit um, unearths the best of their team, allows for their culture to emerge, has things like core values that they constantly revisit. We ask ourselves all the
mhm,
time, like, hey, or we'll notice people, hey, you showed up with empathy today. Like empathy is one of our core values, or playful is one of our core values. Like we bring that in on a regular basis, and we're constantly working. And we have challenges too, but as around one of our core values is sustainable, and we have too many things going on right now, and if we don't create spaces of learning, we know based on the data and our own lived experience that if we don't create pause and reflection, that we're actually hurting ourselves on an ongoing basis. It's not sustainable. And so that to me, from a prosperous nonprofit, is the last thing I'll share too. And this is bringing in the voice of our chief of impact, Sarah Fanslau, who is just absolutely brilliant around impact evaluation, such a heart-driven nonprofit leader too. And she said, our no's give power to our most important yeses. And I think a
Mm.
prosperous nonprofit leader is able to stop saying yes and is able to double down on their unique, specific, and clear value that they bring. And sometimes it's a journey of understanding what that is, but we can't do it all. And that's okay. And so, what are the no's that you can give to your organization and to yourself that empower your own most important yeses? That to me is a prosperous nonprofit who is iterating, who's a learning organization, who is creating rhythms of learning, that it doesn't have to feel like this, oh crap, we probably need to reflect. Like we do quarterly strategic planning inside of our own organization. And the reason why, and
Mhm.
I love it, I mean, I cannot tell you how much it's like this rhythm we can count on, and we do it like 4 hours once a quarter.
Mhm.
Man, is it a powerful rhythm for our team.
Mhm.
Because sometimes we're just going too much, and we actually
Yeah.
regularly we're going too much.
Uh,
And those
right.
rhythms of reflection allow for us to be in that space of learning, because that's really what it is. And we have a joke inside of Thrive Impact, which is it all just learning? Like maybe there isn't failure. Maybe it's all just learning. Is it all learning?
Mhm.
Maybe it's all learning, right? And it's a way of us being playful with it, but at the same time, I think it is,
Mhm.
right? And so, how
Yeah.
do we create the conditions that allow for us to learn? So that to me is another indicator of a prosperous nonprofit. Is they have rhythms around being a learning organization, and that allow for them to reflect on a regular basis, and then apply that learning quickly into
Mhm.
their work.
Mhm. Oh, I love that. So good. I'm so excited because I've been asking this question to everybody that I've been speaking to, and everyone has a completely different answer. And also, nobody is talking about money at all, which I love, because that's not what the question was intended at all. But nobody's been like, somebody who has 6 months of cash on hand. Like nobody's talking about that because
Yeah.
it's so much more. We need so much more than just money. So,
Mm-hmm.
Tucker, thank you so much. Where can our listeners find you?
Just you can find me on LinkedIn, Tucker Wannamaker, or go to thriveimpact.org, and you can check it out there. Again, we have our free workshop that we do on a regular basis. It's the 6 shifts that every nonprofit leader needs to make to lead in the next normal. And
Awesome.
and so we go a little bit more in depth. Not It's a little bit of an overview, but it's still really helpful because you connect with other nonprofit leaders too who are going through similar things, and that's probably
That's
more
awesome.
what's important. Not just the 6 shifts, but also more importantly, connecting with other nonprofit leaders who are learning how to lead in this next normal too. And that's the so I just invite you to come to that. It's usually at the top of our website. You can check out, or you can just email me as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom. I really appreciate you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Oh, appreciate you too, Stephanie. Thanks so much for inviting me. Such a pleasure.